Are you a business owner stuck in fear, doubt, and worry about what the marketplace will look like in the future? Then this show is for you. Strap on your seatbelt and get ready to disrupt and innovate. Here's your host, Lisa Levy.
Welcome to another exciting episode of Disrupt and Innovate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and interviews with trailblazers in the business world. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Denise Conroy. Denise is a true queen maker, someone who has paved her own path to success and now is dedicated to helping other women reach their full potential. Denise's background speaks volumes about her expertise and experience. As a three-time CEO, former CMO of HGTV, and a board director, she has navigated the corporate world with grace and determination. But she's not just about reaching the top herself. She is passionate about empowering and inspiring other women to break through the glass ceiling and claim their rightful place in the C-suite and the boardroom. With her unique blend of experience, teaching acumen, and a no-nonsense approach, she is committed to disrupting the current leadership paradigm. Denise believes in shifting from command and control to outcomes-based leadership, focusing on driving results and creating positive change. Beyond her professional accomplishments, Denise is also a renowned speaker, advisor, and author. Her insights and wisdom have been sought after by industry leaders and organizations looking to embrace growth strategies, emerging trends, and consumer behavior. Join us today as we delve into Denise's journey, her innovative mindset, and her mission to change the game for women in leadership. Get ready for an inspiring conversation. We will challenge your perspectives and ignite your disruptive spirit. Denise, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
I am so excited to hear your story. I do the kind of that read-in that sets the tone and who you are and your background, but it's not your story and it's not your journey. Will you share with the audience your journey and how you got to what you're doing today?
Sure, absolutely. So I have to start with my childhood and how I came up. So I was the oldest child of four, only girl, and I had something pretty terrible happen to me when I was 5 years old. So when I was 5 years old, I was sexually assaulted by a group of neighborhood teenagers, probably ranging in age from, I'd say 15 to 18, 19, somewhere in that range. And I remember the day, honestly, like it was yesterday. My mom had just had twin boys and she was at home on maternity leave. And I had just nagged her to let me go out and play on this beautiful spring day. And finally she was like, okay, but don't tell your dad. My dad was a really controlling guy, very strict. And he would have thought that, being five, it was just too young for me to be outside playing by myself. And she was like, you can go play in this backyard of the apartment complex, which she thought was pretty safe. So did I. And I hadn't been out there very long. These kids came up to me and proceeded to assault me in many different awful ways. And I remember walking into the house and my mom's like, how was playing outside? Remember, don't tell your dad. And I was just just shook my head. It was good, And even at that age of 5, I knew that I couldn't share with her what had happened to me. I wanted to, but I couldn't. I was ashamed. I didn't want to get her in trouble with my dad. I didn't want my dad to go to jail because my dad was one of those people who would start fights over parking spots in our apartment complex. So someone who had hurt his little girl like that, he would have been in prison probably for the rest of his life. So just to know, now that I look back, to know all that as a 5-year-old. And so literally I remember going to the bathroom in our little apartment and cleaning myself up. And I was a changed kid after that. I wasn't precocious. I wasn't, goofy. I wasn't the same person. And specifically, I was anxious all the time. I had a fair amount of PTSD from that. And I numbed my emotions. I didn't know how to feel. I didn't trust anybody. And I didn't know how to actually feel emotions like a regular kid, So I took that with me throughout my adulthood. One of the things that I gravitated towards in my professional life very quickly was dysfunctional environments. I love a good turnaround, right? If you tell me something is awful, it's a mess, it's, big ball of twine, I want to get at it, right? And so much of that, now that I've done a ton of therapy, I take medication, so much of that comes from my childhood. I remember always wanting us to be not so weird, right? Why couldn't we be like the Waltons? Why couldn't we be like the Brady Bunch? Now I know, right, that there is no such thing. That's why they were on television, because they were pretend. But for me, I think that the thread that kind of ties my entire life together is always wanting to not let perfect get in the way of better, right? And so I think that sometimes incremental changes can be incredible for a business, for a relationship, for, many things in our lives, habits. And so I think that's probably that thread that ties everything together, is just wanting to make not just, my immediate area better, but the world a better place. I went to college, I studied political science, and I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. LA law was very big back then. And I thought that's what it was. So my father had said to me, he had worked in state government for a really long time. And he said, in West Virginia, that's where I'm from. And he's like, you should go. He's like, I hang out with attorneys a lot, because he worked at the state capitol. And he's like, you should go hang out with some attorneys. So he got me this like mini internship gig. And I did that, and immediately was like, I don't like these people. I think this is really boring. It's nothing like LA law, imagine. And so fast forward, I'm like, oh crap, like, what am I going to do? Right. Because I was a junior going into my senior year of college. So I started applying to grad schools. And at about the same time that I decided I didn't want to be an attorney, I took a course, and it was called Empirical Political Analysis. And I took it in summer school. And what was wild about it was required for my major, and it was all about surveying and polling and statistical analysis. And I just really fell in love with it. And I was like, okay, I could go to grad school and like do this, this is fun. So I ended up going to Duquesne University, a little private Catholic college in Pittsburgh. So I went to grad school and studied public policy. I knew though that I did not want to go into like the federal government or a think tank, anything like that. But I was like, you know what, with all this surveying and polling, just passion that I have, I could take that into marketing probably, right? So that became my conduit into marketing. I became a market researcher, and I did that for the first 10 years of my career. Then I ended up in television. I was living in Southern California. I ended up getting a job, and I had worked in all kinds of industries. I worked in management consulting. I worked for US Steel because I lived in Pittsburgh. And I ended up out in Southern California, and I needed to find a job. And there was a hunting and fishing television network that was hiring, that was like 8 miles from my house, amazingly, because I wasn't in LA and I wasn't in San Diego. I was kind of in between in Temecula. And so I go in as the first director of research for this company. And a year later, I go into the CEO and I make a proposal, and I'm like, hey, you don't have a formal marketing department, and it's really hurting the company. I notice we're spending money on marketing, but it's all discombobulated. There's no centralized, planning or any strategy to it. And I'm like, here's a proposal or a strategy for a marketing department, and I want to be the first VP that runs it. And so he's like, I'm going to have to think about this. And he interviewed other people that might come in and run it. And then finally he came to me 6 months later. I know it was devastating. I was like, oh, I'm never going to get this job. And then finally 6 months later, he walks into my office and says, I've interviewed everybody. They don't have the joie de vivre that you do. And I'd like you to do it. He's like, I'd like you to take this job. It's yours. So that was sort of how I made that transition from market research into more traditional marketing. And then my career took off. So as you'd mentioned, I became the CMO at HGTV after I'd been at the Outdoor Channel for over 6 years, almost 7. And then I worked at HGTV for only 3 years. I feel like I worked there for 30 years. It was toxic. The actual work was great and interesting. And I was able to accomplish a lot and do a lot of disruption. But that said, I had this, I call them the gang of 5, who harassed me every day, bullied me. And I had never really been a bullied person in my life. So to be in my early 40s and be bullied felt surreal. It was really weird. One day I literally just up and quit. One of my lead harasser was the senior vice president of human resources. She was my peer. Yeah. And I was meeting with her, and she would make me have these horrible check-ins with her like once a month, just as colleagues to touch base. But it really became her browbeating me. And so she came in this January day, and I remember looking out the window. It was a really gloomy day. And I said, I quit. And I couldn't believe that it had left my mouth. But I I didn't expect it, didn't plan on it, but she's like, what? And I said, I quit. Now you can get the F out of my office. And that felt good. That felt really good. And literally I left, and I needed to heal. So I took 10 months to heal, to kind of remember who the hell I was, because I'd been masquerading as something else entirely just to survive. I got into therapy for the first time ever. So at 43, I finally told somebody I'd been raped when I was a little kid, and started to work on all of these issues, this not being able to feel things, the numbing, so many things, so many issues. So I ended up going into therapy at 43, and also looking for my first CEO job. I was like, I'm really good at strategy, and I've done game-changing strategic things that your typical CMO wouldn't necessarily do at a lot of different companies. And I think I could be a CEO. So I wanted to see if anybody was kooky enough to let me run their business. That's when I met these two gentlemen from two separate private equity firms that were partnered on an investment. And I went in and nailed the job interviews and really liked them. I felt like they saw me. I think I saw them as well. And that was a good basis for a partnership. So I got my first CEO role. So as you said, I had two others after that. And then in 2021, I actually, at the very end of 2021, I left. I'd only been at my third CEO job for 6 months. And I decided that I didn't want to stay there anymore, that I felt like I was about to turn 50, and I was tired of being the only woman in so many rooms, boardrooms, rooms of bankers, you name it. I was tired of also being the youngest. I had always been, because I started school early, and, I was always the youngest. And I remember my mother saying, oh, eventually you wait, you won't be, And I was like, God, I'm almost 50 years old, and I'm still the youngest person in the room. That's not young. How is this possible? And at that point, I think in my head, I'd been toying with starting a business where I could be a queen maker, because I felt like I have a lot of experience seeing behind that curtain of power. And it is still just dumbfounding to me that we are in the year 2023 and we don't have more women running things. 2% of global CEOs are women. Like, how is that? How do we, as a controlling group, because we got 51% of the global population, how do we let that happen? And I think we could dive into that. That could be, a whole series of podcasts. But I just think that, for me, I was like, we see lots of kingmakers, the men who are behind great men, but where are the women who are behind great women? And I'm not saying that there aren't other queen makers out there. I'm quite sure there are. I'm just saying that I wanted to go at it sort of in my all-out manner, in a really regimented, planned way. So I launched my coaching business, an executive coaching business, which I never thought I'd be an executive coach. But I did that in 2021. I'm on the second year of my business, and the business has grown tremendously fast. I now have around 500 clients, between the women who, purchase one-on-one coaching sessions, programs with me, but also women who come to my workshops. And my business is part social enterprise, part business, right? So what I like to do is I give out scholarships. I've given out $250,000 worth of scholarships to my workshops, and I specifically, women of color come first. And I literally start with Black women. When you think about the demographic that has had the most difficult time in our history in the US, and you could argue in the world, it's Black women. So when I started handing out scholarships, I started awarding them to those folks. So 60% of that 250,000 has actually gone to women of color.
Denise, thank you for taking us through the whole story and sharing the hard parts of life. You were pulling the thread of, how childhood led to the ability to embrace chaos, to take apart a puzzle or find a broken puzzle and put it back together again. And these are traits, right, that are hugely important and impactful for us to choose to be disruptive. And from my perspective, that means making the choice to challenge the status quo with the intent of a positive impact, right? You have to have that intention behind it, because otherwise we're just making messes. And while that can be fun, it's not helpful. It certainly doesn't help anybody. So I really appreciate that. And with the work that you're doing, the consulting, really, it's the coaching practice that you've set up for women. What is that? How is that journey forcing change? And what I mean by that is, you talked about the 2% of CEOs globally that are women. And I believe that those are not the places that we as women are going to make the actual change. It's the small business owner, the solopreneur who's growing up. So it's going to be that ground up push of women that's going to make the real difference. How does that align with your thinking, and how does that feed in and support what you're doing?
I just want women in power. So to be fair, I've worked with women who are already executives, or they're right on the cusp of being an executive at every type of business known to man, big Fortune 10 corporations, all the way down to smaller founder-led organizations. I just want women in power, because I think that when you can tip that scale and really get those numbers up of women in control, women in leadership positions, then we can start to have some discussions about systemic change. But first, you gotta tip that scale. I will say I work with women who are entrepreneurs. So I've worked with a lot of women who, want to go out and start their own thing. There's power in that. So to your point, I love that. I've had women who've come to me and want to be influencers, professional speakers, politicians. So I kind of work with whatever your brand of being a queen is. I'm your person, right? I am absolutely your person. Because what I also love to do is create these ecosystems. I'm starting to create this with my business. I'm so excited about it. But we do every Tuesday at noon Eastern, we do something called my Zoom office hours. And it's simple. Like, it's just a meeting, you register for it, you get a link to Zoom. And I have a couple of brave men who show up, and men are always welcome, but you got to be, supporters. You got to be allies, sponsors to be in our crew, right? But yeah, we need men, we need everybody, right? Non-binary, you name it. We need every human here pushing this agenda. But what I love about the community we're creating is I think we're all starting to see the collective power in each other, and we see ourselves reflected in each other too, right? That's human. So I think that's been really powerful, as well as to create this ecosystem where women can, really help each other, lift each other. And because I think it's very natural to us to want to help each other out.
So I want to play with that for a minute, because, all right, I came up in the tech space. I was the first woman, the only woman in leadership and management and all of those things, right? So very, those moments of being very kind of alone, looking for the allies and the sponsors who, with best intentions, still may not have been as supportive in the right ways as they wanted to be, but their intentions were good. But in that, there was also the point of coming up on 50 and sort of changes that happen in our world. And I was going through this, and I've lost my own train of thought on what the question was going to be for this conversation. But the point, I guess, is playing with getting out of being the only and having, allies, and how we help the men around us be good allies and be good sponsors.
Yeah. I think it's about holding them accountable. Let's face it, some men are going to be more willing. They've already embarked on this journey where they're helpful to women. I'm married to one, right? He's a very good guy. He's sensitive. And I mean that in all the right ways. He's sensitive to other humans, not just to women. He's just a guy who my husband is a guy who reads emotions very well. And I've worked with men like him. So they're easy sells. They're already doing it, right? But it's, for me, the guys who are in the middle, there's so much, I don't want to do the wrong thing. And I see this in, I embarked a couple of years ago in anti-racist work. Same thing with anti-racist work. A lot of times people won't say something because they don't want to be stupid, or they don't want to be, and that's a problem, because perfection is a part of patriarchy. It's a part of white supremacy. It keeps us all in this little box, right? And we never venture out, and we never vie for other people. So, when you think about how can you help folks, I like to start out soft, right? So if a guy, does something and I'm like, man, that's really crappy. It's either really racist or it's really sexist. I'll usually approach him one-on-one and say, hey, have you considered that perhaps you're treating Sue a little bit differently because she's female, right? And because it's behind closed doors and I'm not embarrassing him, and I will tell you, if I tackle it a couple times behind closed doors, and then I got to tackle it over and over again, I'm probably going to embarrass you in front of other people at some point, because at that point you're just a jerk and you're asking for it, right? So, and some people just need to learn hard too. I've finally figured that out in my life, and sometimes I think I'm that person. Like you have to learn hard. So that I think is the way to go.
Yeah, and never confuse kindness for weakness.
Correct.
Right. being graceful and kind, but it can escalate based on the response on all of that. With your coaching practice, you've talked about you work with you work with women, and you work with them in any form, from entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, influencers in the making, and corporate executives, right? So is there a thread in your approach, right? What is the thing that you do with these women who are all on very different journeys that is a little bit, what is your secret sauce?
My secret sauce is really two things. Number one, I know what the curtain of power looks like. I know what it looks like behind that curtain. And I think what ends up happening is, because so many of these spaces are male spaces, they're also white spaces often, that folks who don't fit into either of those two boxes don't know what it looks like behind the curtain. It is sort of the quintessential Wizard of Oz problem, right? And I know I'm dating myself, but when you think about, the wizard back there behind the curtain, you're like, why is all this happening? And where is it happening? I've been in those rooms where decisions get made, and some of the happy horseshit, sorry for the language, but some of the things considered, like, for example, in a woman's pay versus a man's pay, is ridiculous. Like, I remember being on a board not too long ago where we were talking about the CEO getting a compensation adjustment, and they wanted to make a really considerable comp adjustment. And they started talking about the fact that he was the breadwinner and he had 3 little kids, and his wife stays home. And I'm like thinking to myself, did you talk about this stuff when I was your CEO? And I know they didn't, right? So I just think that these are the things that we have to dismantle, right? So I bring that behind the curtain approach. And then I also have come up with a 7-point framework. So everything I do in coaching, I start with self-actualization. I want people to understand, have good self-awareness, to know who they are and what are the things that really fulfill them. I think that's the place to start, right? And let's be fair, what fulfills you today might not have fulfilled you last year, even last month, right? So we start with self-actualization, and then we get into some of the finer skills of, nuts and bolts stuff, I call it, strategic thinking, financial, reading financials, which sounds super nuts and bolts, and it is. So many women, whether they run their own business or whether they're an executive, if you didn't come up and have an MBA or come up in a finance or a hardcore operational role, you're not going to know how to read a financial statement. That's a problem. And it will cap you if you don't deal with it. Now, one of the things I like to do is position it as it's basic math. It's not very hard, but a lot of people have built financial statements and anything finance related up in their minds. So we do that. We talk a lot about relationships, managing up, down, sideways, but also out. We women, and I do think this is not exclusively a female thing, but it's very common. We're head down, right? We keep our heads down. We get things done. We have incredible stamina. I mean, I grew up with a mom like that, right? So I've watched this. And unfortunately, when you don't raise your head up enough, you don't get a look at the opportunities that might be open to you. So that notion of, oh God, I got to look for a job. I guess I better build a network. Well, if you want to build a network and you don't have one, that's going to be tough. So we believe it or not, touch on really basic things like that. Like, how do you build a network and how do you have the habit to sustain it and keep it going? So that is kind of what I bring. And then I also bring to folks, a lot of my clients, and in my sessions, they'll say, hey, I'm working on an annual strategic plan. Can I get you to take a look at it? And to be able to have a former CEO say, yeah, this is cool. Think about this. It just makes them look great, So.
And so what I love in that, and, we all have our programs and we take our clients through different experiences, but there are themes, right? And there are basic things, and starting with understanding who we are and who each of those clients is, and where they're at, because every one of your clients is going to go through a unique journey through your 7-step program. Everyone is absolutely positively unique, and you have to meet them where they're at. And I love that you're including reading the financials, because we do have this mindset of, a balance sheet or a P&L. These are big, complicated things. And the reality that I love, and I had this conversation with my stepdaughter in college, accounting is addition and subtraction, right? It is actually, right, it is the most simple. You put things in, you take things out. And while we create this sense of complexity, this is not algebra, and it's certainly not calculus. Right. So that whole demystifying it, I think, is really important, because if we don't tackle the foundational needs and skills and capabilities, we create obstacles and roadblocks for our own growth and development. That's absolutely fabulous. As you have built your business over the last couple of years, you're a planner, you had a plan, you had an approach. I know you did, just based on the way you talk. But I'm also a project manager from way back when, and I know that every plan is really awesome until you start working it. So what are some of the things that were challenges and roadblocks that you hit that you had to overcome in creating what you've built?
Yeah, you just reminded me of that military phrase, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, right?
Absolutely.
That's so true. For me, I'm a marketer. So the first thing I felt like was going to be critical, and this is how I ran companies for other people, was I really wanted to go in and define my addressable market. So for me, there are 5 million women executives in the United States. Okay. And that was sort of the starting point. And then I had to figure out, could I serve entry-level folks? Could I serve, middle management, and kind of looking at that whole spectrum. I decided to really focus in on the people who are either, VP, right on the cusp, okay, of becoming an exec, or maybe they're already an exec and, they're having growing pains. I will tell you that the first year as a CEO was the hardest year of my entire career. And I wouldn't have necessarily thought that, because I think when you get to that level, you're like, oh, I've arrived, I'm pretty great. And it's a lonely job. Nobody tells you that. It's real lonely if you do it right, because you don't want to be triangulating your woes and gossiping and all that stuff. Some CEOs do. I don't recommend it. But I just think that the first thing for me was, let's figure out what the demographic is. And then let's figure out, I productized my offering. So I really came at it as in, and I wanted to have, again, the social enterprise piece was, if you take my most expensive coaching package, which is what I launched with, that's a $7,200 package. Let's face it, not every woman can afford that, even if she's an exec, because we know we're underpaid, right? We're still, lagging behind men. So I wanted to make sure that I had a lot of different price points. So I wasn't going to shut women out just because they didn't have the financial wherewithal to afford what I do. So when I productized, that gave me that opportunity. So yeah, I have my Power Up program, which is the 7,200. But then I launched, you could buy a smaller package that you could still get at a discount. You could buy hourly and just do it ad hoc. And then you could even go down and buy my workshops. So workshops are 4 hours over Zoom. And I have 9 of them now, 9 different titles. And I teach every one of them. And when I launched them, they were $300. They're 500 now. They'll probably never go above 500, just because I feel like the price point is decent, and it's something that legitimately you could afford. And again, I've got a scholarship program. So for women who are in between, and that's how I either say that if you're a woman who's in transition, you're looking for that next role, or maybe you're underemployed right now. Especially, there's a lot of women who have a job or they have a couple side hustles and they're still underemployed for the qualifications and expertise they have. So I have those women, scholarships are open to them as well. So I think that those two things, knowing my demo, productizing, but then also you have to have almost your own personal board of directors. For me, that's been my husband, who, I'm annoying as a founder in ways that I was not as a CEO for somebody else. I feel like I was more regimented working for somebody else as a CEO, but I'm all over the place. There are some days I'm like, I don't let my products live long enough. And I'm like, I want to launch another one. And my husband's like, no, don't. Let these breathe, let them live. Exactly.
So that's actually a really fun statement that you just made, right? The role of founder and CEO are really different. There are many people out there who wear both hats, but right in that founder space, it is a little less structured. It is a little more chaotic. Are you enjoying that experience?
I am probably too much. It's so wild. I started writing again. I was a writer as a kid, literally as a kid. And then I didn't write seriously for years, other than I have an English minor. So I wrote for that in college. And then I literally didn't write, which was wild, because my parents were always like, you should be a writer. You're writing so good, and I'm like, you don't just leave and be a writer, leave school. That's weird, because I felt like I had to live and I had to do something to write about. And so during the pandemic, I started writing every single day. I was like, I'm just going to write every day for an hour. And I ended up almost finishing my memoir, which I'm polishing off. But I think for me, it ignited this like creative side to me that I've always had. And I think because I've been in business and I've pushed it down and pushed it aside. So now that I'm creating so much content, we were talking about that, I know, before we started here, I love that piece of it, the content creation, the influencing, the writing. So I quite like the founder thing. Somebody asked me the other day on another podcast, they're like, would you ever be a CEO for somebody else again? And I'm like, man, it'd have to be a real special somebody else, because I like what I'm doing now, you know?
It is interesting. And as you were talking through that, I'm thinking about the picture behind me, which we're only seeing part of it. But what we're seeing is the left side of our brain, our systems and our logic. Right? What we're not seeing is the explosion of color for the creativity and that right brain thinking. And it's so interesting as I have these conversations, people who are stepping into being disruptive have a way of playing in both the left and the right side of their brain, and they bring it together. And it's a unique characteristic that not everybody plays with, but those people who are really challenging the status quo and doing things that are making that impact play with both. And right, they know that there's a time and a place for logic and decisive decision making and a plan. And then there's time you just go with your feeling and you go big and you make it. And yeah, so I love hearing, right, because the founder and the CEO hats lean into those sides of our brain differently.
Yeah, they really do. And so it's interesting. I find one of the things, my approach to disruption is I like to look at, and I did this throughout my career, I love to look at things that are normal, that everybody takes as for granted. Like, well, this is how we do business. This is how it works, how it's, and I like to look at those things and ask myself, what if we took that and like completely turned it on its head? And sometimes I'll, like, when I was a CEO, I would float that in a room and people would be like, why would we do that? You know, I'd really get this visceral reaction. But sometimes when you just start to entertain that, you come up with some really neat ideas, especially when you have a room full of people who can add to it.
Yeah.
So.
And that, right, that spirit of experimentation, of playing with it and figuring, taking the idea, teasing it out, seeing what's possible, going and playing with the things that are probably not realistic, but they spur the creativity to get to that next thing, which is really actionable. Denise, this has been an absolutely great conversation. If people who are listening or watching want to find you, where are the best places to look?
Yeah, so they should go to my website, Themy, THEMY, LLC.com. And that's where you can take a look at the programs I offer. I have a store, so you can buy my workshops and my coaching there. I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can just look for Denise Conroy on LinkedIn. And then I'm also on TikTok, and it's Denise_Conroy on TikTok. So.
Absolutely awesome. This conversation today, we have gone through in your journey, right? The need to get rid of the idea of being perfect. We need to just get to being better, and we need to own that. And the need to lead with a purpose to make that impact. And as women, as we work collectively together, we can actually make amazing change happen. And while we may feel alone in our CEO seats or even in our founder seats, we can come together with queen makers like Denise and leverage the knowledge and experience of people who have already been there to get the results that we're trying to build in our world, whether it's our business or our journey in corporate space. Lots of actionable nuggets that we've had today. Denise, thank you so much. And for our listeners and viewers, don't get left behind. Join me next time.
That's it for today's episode of Disrupt and Innovate. Head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. Every single week, one lucky listener that posts a review on iTunes will win the grand prize drawing, a $15,000 private VIP day with Lisa Levy. And be sure to head over to disruptandinnovate.com and get your free copy of Lisa's gift. And join us on our next episode.